It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dirk Schulze-Makuch, who may tell you how to properly pronounce his name in German. Dirk is professor in the School of the Environment at Washington State University and a guest lecturer at the Technical University in Berlin, an adjunct professor at the Beyond Center at Arizona State University. He earned a diploma in geology at the Justus Liebig University and a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He began his academic career at the University of Texas at El Paso, was a faculty fellow at NASA Goddard, and then joined the faculty at WSU. He's the recipient of the Friedrich Wilhelm Award of the Humboldt Foundation for extraordinary achievements in the field of exobiology. He is an author on more than 100 scientific publications and 2 science texts, including the Astrobiology Primer, Life in the Universe, Expectations and Constraints. He's also written 3 popular books on science and 2 science fiction novels. And he is something of a media figure, appearing on documentaries for National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, NHK TV of Japan, and ARD in Germany. His talk tonight is entitled, The Search for Life in the Solar System and Beyond, Habitats and Exotic Possibilities. Please, let's welcome Dirk to the lectern.
Thank you for coming, and I hope you all brought an open mind, because we're going at some places where no one has gone before. Perhaps some have. Anyway, so I'd like to take you on a tour through the solar system, if you want so, and point out certain places where there could be life. And we will also go a little bit beyond that. First of all, we go to Venus and think perhaps there was at some point life, and pointed out Venus is very hot and some organisms may like it hot. Then we will go to Mars, which is, of course, the red planet is always very interesting and we'll like to look at it. And there it's cold. And then we'll look at Titan, which is truly exotic with hydrocarbon lakes, or basically oil lakes on the surface. And we'll look at some exoplanets, and at the very end, that was the cutest alien I could find on the internet. We will talk a little bit about the Fermi paradox. So let's start with possible life on Venus. Well, certainly there's nothing on the surface. This is not an alien artifact. This is a Soviet probe that landed there and survived for about 20 minutes because it was simply too hot. Average surface temperature is about 450 degrees C. That is about the temperature in the baking oven. Pressure 92 bars. So that is really not very friendly. However, Venus was not always like this. Venus used to be in the habitable zone. That means liquid water on the surface. And there's various lines of evidence for past ocean on Venus, basically on isotopic ratios, on the evolution that you have on water, carbon dioxide atmospheres. And just if we look at Venus and Earth is very close together, right? So Earth got a lot of cometary water, so should have Venus. Venus is about the same size as Earth, so there should be actually a very similar history. And so there could be actually a history of life on Venus. We know, well, we don't know, but we assume that life on Earth originated very early on, about 4 billion years ago. Well, the Venus, like I said, was in the habitable zone, is a terrestrial planet, so the situation, the environment was very similar. So if life originated on Earth, it could have as well originated on Venus because the conditions were very similar. There's another possibility, though, and that is that recently we found out that many microbes can survive space travel in form if they are within meteorites or asteroids, and they're not getting very much heated inside. So if we have an asteroid impact or meteorite impact on Earth, it could brought the microbes that we have on Earth to the Venusian ocean. So, and that would be a great thing because the bacteria would have found a habitable environment and spread over there. And anyway, if you have an impact there, the sun is the center of gravity. If it goes towards the inside, they would land, or some would be intersected on Venus. So there's really two possibilities. So it's very logical to entertain those possibilities. So let's think about this for a moment and go a little bit further. This is how I imagine the early ocean on Venus. That's actually a picture from California, but we're not going there. Yeah? This is how we imagine it. It's pretty hot. The thing is that we have certain organisms on Earth that are phototrophic, thermophilic microbes of early Earth. They use photosystem 1. They don't use a photosystem that the plants outside use. And they use hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide plus light, and then they produce some organic compounds, water, and so forth. And those early organisms, they're usually called purple sulfur bacteria or green sulfur bacteria. They would fit ideally into this early ocean on Venus. So if they would hitch a ride on an asteroid, they would have found a great environment on the ocean. Now, obviously we have a problem now with life on Venus nowadays, because there is no ocean anymore. So, what happened to the ocean? Well, Venus got hotter and hotter, and the ocean went away. So, if I think now let's assume for a moment we are those microbes, right? And this bad situation happens that it's getting hotter and hotter, and we cannot sustain ourselves in the ocean anymore. What are you going to do? You want to survive, right? Where can you survive? Well, there's two possibilities. First, you can go underground, but that didn't really work out very well either because Venus just heated up too much. The other way is to go up. And on Venus, that wouldn't be too bad of a problem because the atmosphere is very thick. So if you want to survive, the only way is to go up. And actually, there is one place which is actually not too bad, which is the lower cloud layer on Venus. It's about 50 kilometers above the surface. And over there, we find clouds that are much larger, more continuous and stable than the clouds on Earth. I know what you're saying. Well, there can't be any life in clouds, right? If there would be, we would see green clouds on Earth. They would be green and would do photosynthesis, right? Well, on Earth, if you go up, it's getting really cold. You just have ice crystal. It's simply too cold. But remember, on Venus, it's really hot, right? So if you go up, you're actually at temperatures between 30 and 80 degrees C. So that could be actually a habitat. The atmosphere is in disequilibrium with hydrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide coexisting. This is always the argument that we use for life on Mars. We're not in Mars yet. We're on Earth, right? On Earth, we're saying, well, the biggest evidence for life on Earth is that we have oxygen and we have methane and they're in disequilibrium. Well, actually, you have here compounds that are in disequilibrium as well. Not as strongly as in disequilibrium, but nevertheless. Then you have something odd. In the lower cloud layer, it contains non-spherical particles comparable in size to microbes on Earth. They are a few microns in diameter. And they are enriched at the altitude of about 50 kilometers. And this probe, here's a Pioneer probe, was actually sent to there long ago in the 80s to crack those open. But unfortunately, the paralyzer jammed, so we never found out what they are consisting of. Then, the environmental conditions there are what I would call extreme but manageable. Temperature 30 to 80 degrees C, pressure 1 bar, well, that's like on Earth's surface, and pH 0. Well, pH 0 is a little bit tough, right? It is pretty far down. But there are organisms, like here Acidianus infernus, which grows optimally at 88 degrees C and pH from 0.5 to 5.5. So that still would kind of fit. No question it would be challenging, but not completely excluding. Then we have an odd thing with Venus. Venus superrotates. That means on the surface it actually moves so slowly that if you could walk, you could outrun the sunset. But the atmosphere is moving really fast around it. So the day-night cycle is 4 to 6 Earth days compared with 117 Earth days on the surface. So in principle, you could do photosynthesis there. Then we have an unknown absorber of UV irradiation. This has these black streaks here. Something is there absorbing UV light. And while water is scarce on Venus, water vapor concentration reached several hundreds parts per million in the lower cloud layer. So there is actually water. And this is the only place on Venus where we can find actually water. So the argument is then, if life arose or was transported to Venus and gained a foothold, think about life. It always wants to survive. It works like a parasite, right? If you once on a planet, it will be very difficult to get it rid of. At a time when liquid water was available on the Venetian surface, then the descendants of those early forms could have adapted to the increasingly warm, dry, and acidic conditions through directional selection. And the transport into the atmosphere would have been easier because the Venetian atmosphere is thicker. And besides, there's no other way to go to survive. So there could be microbes that could still live in the Venusian atmosphere in the cloud layer today. And we went a little step further and said, well, if you want to find life, we cannot just look for a single microbe. It would be lonely and it would just not really quite work. You would need to have at least a mini ecosystem, some cycling. So I started with that. Let's start over here too. So one organism or type of organism would do photosynthesis. This is a reaction as described here, and they produce here reduced carbon and water, right? That is really useful. And then those organisms that use this system here, they're basically oxidizing carbon and reducing sulfur either to hydrogen sulfide or to carbonyl sulfide. They produce a reduced sulfur, so they would nicely feeding back. And so that would be a system that would be basically sustained by light. And could there be an atmosphere? Could be then life in that atmosphere? Also, carbonyl sulfide (COS) is a common gas. It's the second most common sulfur gas. On Earth, COS is typically only found in association with biological activity. That doesn't mean that it's on Venus like this, but that may be another hint. And we have one major problem. I don't want to hide that up. And that is UV irradiation is harmful. We know that because we're getting sunburn, right? And the reason why is that is because UV radiation is especially there strong where DNA and proteins are the most sensitive to radiation. So on Earth, we deal with that with specialized organic pigments, like in your skin. Some organisms here have multiple copies of DNA, large nucleus, and some other nice tricks. Then you can have layers of water for protection. Obviously, that is not a choice for Venus. Or ozone, that doesn't work really for Venus either. Well, you could use efficient repair mechanisms, but that wouldn't quite cut it. But there is something else what could protect microbes in the lower cloud layer on Venus. And that is what is called cyclooctasulfur, S8. That is this stuff when you go in the drugstore, the yellow sulfur that you get. That is the most stable form of sulfur. It's very stable and actually does not react with sulfuric acid. You have also sulfuric acid there in the atmosphere. It absorbs strongly in the UV wavelengths and re-emits in the visible wavelengths. So it is fluorescent, right? And so you could have microbes that deposit the elemental sulfur on the cell to convert UV radiation into electromagnetic frequencies usable for photosynthesis. So you could actually then use the UV light for photosynthesis that way. And you know, we are always looking for analogs on Earth, right? There are purple sulfur bacteria and green sulfur bacteria that actually deposit elemental sulfur on their cell walls. We know that from organisms at Yellowstone. So if we now look, well, okay, cyclooctasulfur, do we find it? And if you look here at this graph, which is a little bit busy, this is atoms per sulfur molecule from 0 to 8. This is altitude. So here's the lower cloud layer we are talking about 50 kilometers up, where those interesting particles are. And this is sulfur mass density. That means there's more sulfur this way. And if we look here at this curve over here, we see that there is a maximum of S8 in the lower and middle cloud layer. So there's the most cyclooctasulfur. So that would work. So that could work as UV protection. And if we look at the absorbance spectrum from S8, it has a peak at 285 nanometers, meaning exactly there where DNA and protein is the most sensitive. So what we proposed is a mode 3 particle retrieval mission to Venus. What we want to have, and that was popularized by Popular Science, is something like this, a balloon, and here we have our sample container, or, basically a sample container. The balloon floats at the altitude of 50 kilometers and maybe uses some aerogel or so to collect the samples. So a mission overview would be like this. Launch the mothership with a probe on an energy-saving trajectory to Venus. Oops. Okay. Back to Venus. And then capture by aerobraking and get to a circular orbit at about 150 kilometers altitude. Release the probe with a collector on a parachute to 50 kilometers. That's where we really want to go. Inflate the balloon close to the sampling altitude of 50 kilometers and collect the sample. Then we fire the rocket on the probe to lift the capsule to the mothership without shooting it down to 150 kilometers, so getting the sample up again. Rendezvous with the mothership. Return the mothership to Earth, capture by aerobraking, and then a rendezvous with the International Space Station. Because if there's Venusian microbes on it, we don't necessarily want to have it back on Earth, and we could nicely analyze it in the International Space Station, and it would have a great use. So that is the idea about Venus as a possible habitat for life, where most of the people never think about Venus, that there could be something existing. But remember again that Venus was a habitable planet and had an ocean on its surface. Something what Mars had too very long ago. You see over here, this is all a very flat area. It is suggestive, and more evidence is piling up, that this was actually covered by an ocean very early on. Now Mars is cold and dry. Here there were the volcanoes. We had some activities. This is Valles Marineris, about 3,000 kilometers long. The Grand Canyon is a ditch compared to it. Well, water on Mars, well, it looks really, stuff has flown over there. This is a nice dendritic river pattern. This is Raoul Valleys from Mars Express. The blue stuff here is not water, but what we think water-rich minerals. There's definitely water on the North Pole. There's a little bit carbon dioxide, but most of it is water, water ice. So probably more than there's in all of Greenland. So our views have really changed there. And this is maybe the most indicating that Mars is still an active planet. Look, this is with one Mars Global Surveyor, I think it was. This is a gully, how it appeared in 2001. And in 2005, they flew over it again, and that's how it looked in 2005. So what happened there? What is that? That is, it looks mostly that this is a salt trace. So water broke through here, flowed for a small amount of time down and sublimated and left the salt trace. So this actually is evidence that there's still liquid water on Mars today, but unfortunately for very small amounts of time. There's also likely hydrothermal activity on Mars. And we put that together as ideas in 2007 in a paper where we compared the various areas on Mars where we think there's hydrothermal activity with areas on Earth. And this was our hit of top 10 sites on Mars. And actually nearly Fosse, just before the Curiosity rover lifted off, was also identified on the site where we have, as it looked, that there was methane emanating from it. But that was too late because the Curiosity rover was already going to another place. So one of the things what I like now to point out and take you with me on a little bit of a limb is, think about it that Mars is a different planet. It is not Earth. Once. The second thing, Mars is a planet. It's a really big place, right? It's not just one little environment. So if you live on Mars, or you want to live today on Mars, how can you survive? Again, there's not much water. There used to be a lot of water, but not anymore. So what we went through is thinking about it, how can I survive on Mars today? So let's think about near-surface extremophiles on Mars. And one of the hypotheses we put forward is that they could use hydrogen peroxide incorporated in the intracellular fluids. You may think hydrogen peroxide, I use that, to sterilize things. But hydrogen peroxide has a lot of other uses as well. First of all, it's a great antifreeze. It lowers the freezing point really far down, basically to minus 56 degrees C. If you have a cold and dry planet, that is a great thing. The mixtures of hydrogen peroxide concentration super cool and don't form ice crystal. That's great too, because ice crystal can pierce cellular membranes. You don't want that. Then they have hygroscopic properties, the hydrogen peroxide. That means it's like honey. It attracts water directly from the atmosphere. What better can you wish? There's no flowing water on Mars anymore. There's no lakes anymore. If I want to survive, I have to get the water directly out of the atmosphere. And then it could be a source of oxygen. Obviously, there's oxygen in H2O2. And we could even think about possible types of metabolism, some kind of photosynthesis reactions. And the hydrogen peroxide, of course, can be broken down to water and oxygen. So we went even a step further and said, well, we had one live detection experiment that NASA did very long ago, and the older ones from you may remember it. And if that is correct, that maybe the organisms that we hypothesize would have as ideal adaptation mechanism hydrogen peroxide in their intracellular fluids, how could that explain the Viking experiments? So we looked at this. Well, the people of you who remember it, the deciding factor was really the GCMS, the gas chromatograph mass spec, because it didn't find any organic molecules. Now, if you have organisms that have hydrogen peroxide in their cells, what is happening to them? Well, if you heat it up, the hydrogen peroxide disintegrates to OH radicals, and they are very reactive, and they would oxidize any organic compounds to CO2, to carbon dioxide. And this actually was exactly what the GCMS measured, 50 to 700 ppm of carbon dioxide. That never was really explained how that came into being. So that would already explain the GCMS result. Then it was always assumed that there was an oxidant, this mysterious oxidant. And people thought, oh, maybe titanium oxide on the surface, or maybe some kind of other oxidant. And the thing was, well, the Martian surface seems to be at least a little bit below, somewhat reducing actually. So if the oxidant is actually within the organism, that would explain this as well. Then we had the gas exchange experiment, and there's a lot of different reactions that probably went on, some chemically and some possibly biologically. But what I want to put your emphasis on it is the pyrolytic release experiment. And the thing is now over here. This was the results. The first result was this showed organic synthesis with a radioactive tracer. And that was very significant. That was a positive detection of life just by itself. Then there was another control run that was 15 that confirmed that. And then there were a couple of other ones. They were less conclusive. And then there was actually one still that was run under wet conditions. And the wet condition, notice how little that is, 2.8. That was much less than the control. So how could we explain that? And I tell you how. If the organisms are adapted to these cold and dry conditions on Mars, and you give them too much water, they don't like that. That is the same way if I would come as an alien to planet Earth and saying, oh, you're human. You look thirsty. You need water. Grab you and put you in the middle of the ocean. That's what we basically did there. And that's probably why we got those results. Then there was still the labeled release experiment. And Gil Levin till today is still arguing that it showed metabolism and what it really looked like, metabolic reactions, yes. But the interpretation was at the time that this experiment by itself alone is not conclusive enough because the other ones did not show indications of life. A couple of things still. You might know this handsome guy or not. This is a bombardier beetle. And I put it there against the argument that hydrogen peroxide and biology don't fit. If you bother this little guy here, what he does, he sprays a 25% solution of hydrogen peroxide on you. I can promise you, you don't like it. But the point is that he has it in his belly over here, and he perfectly lives well with it. It doesn't disintegrate him. And there's other bacteria in your mouth, for example, streptococcal and staphylococcal bacteria that produce or utilize hydrogen peroxide. So it is not an enemy of life. Oops. And then, of course, the Phoenix mission detected perchlorates. And perchlorates are very interesting too, because they have some of the very similar properties to hydrogen peroxide. if you have a water-magnesium perchlorate mixture, here is a chemical equation for the chemically inclined of you, you can go actually down this minus 70 degrees C and keep the water liquid. A perchlorate water mixture would be also hygroscopic, so you can use it as well to attract water from the atmosphere. So that would be another way that would work. And then we're always looking at analog sites. Okay, what do we expect to find on another planet, and what do we find on Earth? And the Atacama Desert is the driest desert on Earth, so it is very interesting to us. And we find here also perchlorate. And if you look at the topography and how things look here, Mars and Earth look here very similar. And even in the core of the Atacama Desert, we still find cyanobacteria and organisms that actually use not the perchlorate, but halite, which is a salt crystal, to directly get water from the atmosphere. So in principle, they use the same function or the same property. So hygroscopicity, I think, is really adaptation to a changing planet in this case. This was how Mars looked, a much more friendlier place. It still was cold, but you actually had some liquid water there. That's how Mars looks now. Microbes on Earth using halite to attract water from the atmosphere because it doesn't rain much either. And we even have animals, like here's a thorny devil that has hygroscopic grooves between the spines of his skin to capture water in its desert habitat. So that is a kind of a usual adaptation feature. And that's what we would expect on Mars as well. Of course, there's a lot of discussion whether life on Mars or not. I think if you put it all together, and I could still talk the whole lecture about Mars, I don't want to do that, because we all want to move on. We want to see what other places are still out there. But, you know, we have the same argument with, you know, if we say life could hitch a ride on an asteroid from Earth to Venus, it could also from Earth to Mars or from Mars to Earth, in which way we would be all Martians in a way. That could have happened. We had oceans on Mars 4 billion years ago. That means it was a habitable planet. We find here very similar things in analog environments. There's a Martian meteorite. There's still magnetic chains, which we find only in magnetotactic bacteria. This is still a big contention about the Martian meteorite, and I don't go into detail, but it is still inconclusive. We found methane on Mars, which became now inconclusive too, even though 3 different instruments found it, but the Curiosity rover didn't find it, so we don't know really what to make out of it. Viking I just mentioned before, so there's actually a lot of arguments to be relatively optimistic about life on Mars. And of course, we have now the Mars Science Laboratory, also called Curiosity rover, that roved there around. And it actually found evidence for a lake environment only 3.1 billion years ago. But that was at a time when usually we all think that Mars was already cold and dry. So there were still liquid surface water bodies on Mars. So what we really want to do is to explore this place. And this is one of my colleagues over here. Yeah, he's German, and maybe that's it looks like an invasion. But the thing is, you know, if you want to do it right and want a lot of information, of course that is the right way to do it. You know, you have a lot of rovers, you have balloons here, or zeppelins, and then you have a satellite, and you get all the data. The point is, you cannot understand life without its context. And the context is the environment. So the environment and life is intrinsically intertwined. You cannot understand one without the other. So this is, in principle, it is the right approach. But nobody will fund it unless I can convince some people to do it, perhaps. And so, well, we're not going there now. Okay. Okay, one other thing what we suggested, which was of course created a lot of controversy, is suggesting a human one-way mission to Mars. This could be a first step in a colonization effort with some supplies being provided by Earth, but the idea would be also you take the Martian resources. It's much cheaper than a round trip. Well, that should be, for the budget people, very exciting. But the point is more that it ensures future exploration. Because, of course, when you bring the people there, you don't want that they starve and die there, right? You have to further bring supplies. You want to build up a base that ensures future exploration. And the resources on Mars should be harvested as much as possible. My students suggested to put it on Facebook and YouTube, so if you're interested, we also put a book, Paul Davis and I put a book on together on that idea. So, and some of you may not like it, you know, colonization has this bad image. But you know, every biological species is colonizing it. If you find a biological species that is not colonizing, is not alive anymore. So it is really a biological imperative, that's what we do. And I hate to bring it to you. We are in a dangerous world, in a dangerous corner of the universe. There are supernova explosions, there's asteroid impacts, there's all kinds of space hazards. And yeah, if you don't believe me, ask the dinosaurs. You can't, right? Because I'm right. And the colonization, just putting the point still, is among all forms of life, including microbes, insects, and mammals. So what we really have to do is, if you are interested in our long-term survival, we have to colonize other planets. And Mars is really the planet to do it, because it has so many resources. And we also thought about the cost. And our estimate will just a little bit change, $20 billion. But that would compare to about $100 billion with return trip. So cost-benefit ratio would be enormous, because if you would have a return mission, the astronauts would only stay for a short period of time, while if you just leave them there, that would be for a long time and looking at things and doing things. And we put that in a paper, and we got, Paul and I got about 1,000 emails of people who volunteered for such a mission. And we never asked for it, right? But that shows that there's still some excitement there, which is encouraging. And the point what we want to make is that this is not a suicide mission, and the astronauts would not be abandoned. Actually, NASA headquarters, when they heard about it, they didn't like it at all. They said, no, we have nothing to do with this. We don't want to do it. We never would do it. We always bring our people back, you know, like the military. We always bring our people back. But actually, in the 80s, they worked on that idea, what we later found out. Prior to the first one-way mission, robotic missions will be sent to prepare for the arrival of the first astronauts. Of course, you cannot just send them. There's nothing there, just a little bit dirt, right? So you have to put it robotically. You put a robotic station first. The astronauts would be expected to become more and more self-sufficient, but robotic missions would be still launched on a regular basis. Once certain milestones would be passed to expand the base, new one-way missions would be launched. You know, so you basically build up. And then at some point, you really don't need them anymore, because hopefully, further far in the future, we actually have the shuttle between Mars and Earth going. So that could be your home on Mars. Since we don't have a shuttle anymore, maybe we have, well, the Russian shuttle is probably not very attractive anymore either. We have to build something new, I guess. But you know, that would be still used as a shelter. Whichever spacecraft you use, you just leave on Mars too. And, you know, we wouldn't tell the astronauts, but if something goes horribly wrong, maybe they still can go back. So you would have that as a shelter, but then you have this lava caves, you know, and these lava tubes caves are much larger on Mars than they're on Earth because there's less gravity on Mars. So this would be great. Some of them have natural windows already. If not, you put some windows there inside, you have some lights, you can grow some fungi there too that you can eat. Well, some of them actually taste. And you wanted to have some kind of greenhouses there too, you know, where you actually put some plants in. And some of the soil actually is working there. So at some point you would expanding the base, you know, you would still be, part of it would be still within a mountain or something like that, because if there's a solar flare or something like that, you still want to have good protection. And the point is, the old pioneering spirit is still alive. You know, nobody asked those guys, you know, I think they volunteered. But anyways, they went over there, and they were not sure whether they would come back, right? Being a pioneer on Mars is surely risky, but so are many adventure sports and jobs in the armed forces and the emergency services. Those people take a high risk too, and they do it, right? Because they feel convinced about that's the right thing. And if we think about it, yes, if we're going there, those people that go there have a reduction in life expectancy. There's no question. We don't have the medical services on Mars that we would have on Earth, right? But if you balance it, would that not balance it to have a higher chance that humanity or life on Earth survives in case of a space disaster? So we think that balances it. One other thought that most of you probably not thinking about. This is how the oceans looked on Mars 4 billion years ago. So if we would find life, it is more than just an academic thing. It actually can be very helpful, because at that time, the earliest life may be very similar to what we find in Yellowstone Park. And what we find that the microbes are kind of together in form of biofilms. And if they do that, this could help us in some unexpected way. Because if we have a second example of life, which is maybe even would be better if it would be independent from life, Earth life, but which came close to multicellularity, you know, and the biofilms are the first step toward it, then we could have maybe some other ideas how those organisms dealt with what is a curse for us as multicellular organisms, cancer. Because only multicellular organisms can get cancer, because it's basically, right, the communication doesn't work right. And if you notice it, what kind of stresses do we have on Mars? We have radiation, we have a lot of oxidants and toxic compounds. This is the same stresses that cause cancer in humans on Earth. So even though it seems to be kind of a far-fetched perhaps, but as with space explorations has been shown many times, there can be a lot of unexpected benefits from it. Okay, let's go from Mars a little bit further, and let's go to Europa. So this is Europa, that is the surface of Europa, that is one of the moons of Jupiter, and there's a lot of cracks inside, and looks quite interesting. That's Triton, by the way. That is one other icy satellite, and there's actually some organics on the surface. But we will focus on Europa for now, because the internal structure is like that. You have an ice layer. Nobody knows how thick it is, probably a few kilometers, a few miles. Then what we think that we have an ocean underneath that has a depth of about 100 kilometers. So if you think of Earth as a water planet, well, this one has more water. And then you have a mantle, that is normal layering in a planet or a large moon. And then probably you have some of those vents where some of the heat is going out. So you have some kind of hydrothermal vents, and where you have some convection cells. That may remind you of what we see on the ocean floor on Earth. We have the hydrothermal vents too. There's coming gases out, and you find a lot of microbes there. You find even bigger pieces of life. You sometimes even octopus or something like that. So these are little islands on life that at the time of the Viking missions, we didn't even know that were existing on Earth. And those little islands of life on the ocean floor, these are the only places really that is not powered by photosynthesis, but by chemosynthesis. We tried also to model it and say, okay, let's say we have this kind of reaction that we usually have at the hydrothermal vents. Hydrogen, carbon dioxide, with lots, if you have volcanic activity, to methane and water, gives you this much energy. Then we said, okay, we start with this and we think about a modeled kind of ecosystem. And we start with this. Then we say the energy source, let's assume this exhales this amount of hydrogen per year. And that is correlated to what Earth's mantle releases, and then adjusted to that Europa is a bit smaller. Microbial mass, of course, we have no idea what microbes weighs on Europa, but we know what's on Earth, about 4 picogram. Microbial habitats, we say the lower 100 meters of the ocean. We just assume that reaction. So what is the energy requirement of the organisms? We don't know. But one very studied organisms, one of my favorite ones, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it produces beer, is not likely to exist on Europa, I realize that, but this organism, we know what the energy requirement is. So we'll plug it in for anaerobic growth and maintenance, right? 3.2 kilojoule per gram. Then we assume, okay, the energy conversion is, if you have this different trophic levels, so from microbe to the next one, to that eats the microbe, and the next one, the efficiency is usually 10%, which may seem low for you, but that's how it is on Earth. And if we model that, put that there inside, we get something that there's 10 to the 7 microbes per liter as producers. This is like in a nutrient-poor environment on Earth compared to that. You have some consumers, 81 per cubic meters. Of course, there's not many of them. Detrivores, that is the things that eat the crap on the ground. Then tertiary consumers weighing 1 milligram. That would be the size of a brine shrimp. And so if you scale this all up, you would end up with basically 1 brine shrimp in a swimming pool. So there would be enough food for 1 brine shrimp. So you get a kind of an idea, well, there's not that much food, but it still would be sustainable in principle. Well, then you think about it. Okay, you can have chemical reactions to power the organism. You don't have any light, of course, because you have the ice layer above it. What could you use otherwise? Well, perhaps you could use salinity gradients near the ocean bottom to power an organism. So those organisms could float between the salt-rich lower area of the ocean floor with a lower salt content above. And if you do that and push those ions there through, then you could have an energy yield of about 0.006 electron volt per water molecule, or to translate it really, you can build 1 ATP molecules for 50 water molecules that go through the system. And to have this kind of salinity gradient, what we see in nature is, for example, 0.7 osmoles between intracellular fluids and surrounding environments, and we see that on sharks on Earth. So they can deal with it, and there's some microbes that can even deal with higher salinity gradients. And then it could be working like this, right? It would be energy favorable here to push there out water, and over here to let the water in. Of course, there would be still kind of a system to go up and down here, but then the water flux could be coupled to a reaction that forms a high energy covalent bond. So in principle, that could work. And we know on Earth that many organisms are sensitive to other type of energy sources. But for metabolism, only light and chemical energy is used. But we think that is the case only because chemical energy and light is very abundant on Earth. But on Europa or an icy moon, it is not. Okay, let's go still a little bit further. And this is Titan, which is one of my favorite moons. And Titan, this is a surface image and from the Huygens probe. And you see already, this is quite amazing. That looks like a shoreline, right? And Titan has all this kind of features that remind you at a terrestrial planet. Only the thing is that Titan is very, very cold. What we have here is now that we have an atmosphere of 1.5 bar. The atmosphere is actually thicker. And then we have methane clouds and methane rain that actually at some point, like as a monsoon, comes down and rains onto the surface. So the role that water plays on Earth is played by methane on Titan. We even have hydrocarbon lakes on the surface. So this is ethane-methane mixture, really. Then we have geysers, methane water geysers that come here up. And below a certain surface, we have, well, I don't know how we would call it. It's not groundwater. It's a groundwater mix of water and ammonia, so to keep it still liquid. And below that, we still expect a subsurface ocean as well. So this is a really intriguing type of environment. So the idea is, again, that we can say, okay, nowadays Titan is really cold. We wouldn't expect a global biosphere, but in certain niches, it's warmer, where you have thermal activity, and there could be life. But how could it come there in the first place? Oh, well, at some point, the Titan surface warmer in this early history, and then it got gradually colder and colder, and then life could have adapted to the colder and colder conditions. And this is another image of the surface, and you see here that there's actually flows of ethane and methane on the surface, like a river pattern. Actually, they are not only hydrocarbon ones, but there are white ones too, which we think is frozen ammonia water slurries that were on the surface and froze there. So if you look at the Cassini mission, we actually, first of all, we see a lot of lakes on Titan. That is quite amazing. Some are the size of Lake Superior. And some of the indications are indicative for possible life. So the Titan smooth surface that shows endogenic activity, liquid ethane and methane on the surface, on the flow channels, and many organic compounds. And one of the students put this one here inside. So I put a cross so that nobody gets the wrong idea about it. You know, this is the only surface image that we had from the lander, from the Huygens probe on the surface of Titan. So we just see a lot of boulders and cobbles and stuff. But the bird fits perfectly in, right? It fits there. But of course, we won't have any birds on Titan. But what we might have is a different way of life to make a living there. Remember, Titan's surface is really cold. So one of the possibilities is this reactions. Acetylene plus hydrogen forms methane. And acetylene is quite common there and is produced on Titan. And you don't want to, you know, would say, okay, let's try that out in the lab and test it with acetylene in the lab. And probably after a short while, you won't have a lab anymore, because it's very explosive under Earth conditions. But this is exactly what you need if you're in a really cold environment. You want to have enough energy going into the system. And all of them have been found in Titan's atmosphere. It gives you a lot of energy. And the other thing is it produces methane. And this methane is a little bit of a life indicator always, or can be one. Because methane is destroyed by UV radiation, or by a lot of types of radiation. And there's about 4 to 5% of methane in Titan's atmosphere. And that should be all destroyed within 10 million years. But we still have that amount of methane in the atmosphere, so something has to produce it. And we can go even further, you know all that, our metabolism is based on redox reactions. There's a couple of radical jumps involved in some of the metabolic reactions, but generally we don't like a radical reaction, right? Because it tears our tissue apart. So we don't like it. Again, you're on Titan, you're not on Earth. It's very cold, and radical reactions give you a lot of energy. And all of those have been detected on Titan. And if you put those two together, you get cyanamide. And for those who don't know it, cyanamide is on Earth used to glue amino acids together to peptides, the proteins. And this one produces hydrocyanic acid, and which is, possibly related to the origin of life. It's a very interesting molecule. So you can get very interesting things. So on Earth, reactions involving radicals are difficult to control and cause internal damage to the organisms. But if you're at these temperatures, this is really what you want. So again, think about it that you're a poor organism on this moon and you want to survive. You do anything to survive. And this would be one of the places where maybe you find a nice cozy niche there, This is one of the hydrocarbon lakes, and over here you have overheated volatile compounds and ammonia water ice that is liquid. The acetylene happens actually to be heavier than the ethane and would settle here on the ground, and perhaps you have still some silicate rocks over there. You have everything what you want for survival. So this was work. One thing what we have to keep in mind, though, is we don't have really, unless you get by with this little bit ammonia water that may be liquefied, we don't have water as a solvent anymore. We have now ethane-methane mixture, hydrocarbons. So on oil and water, as you know, don't mix. So we can't have a membrane really, or we don't want to have it, that has hydrophilic heads there and interact with water ideally. We would want to have hydrophobic ends, right? So we have to basically reinvent the membrane or turn it around. So that's one of the reasons too why Titan is so exciting. Because if you find life on Mars or Venus, it might be very much related to Earth life, or maybe one origin. But Titan is so different that we would really expect that would be an independent or origin of life. And we could even think about that we could find alternative building blocks there. Because the membranes could incorporate silanes as building blocks, and silanes are liquid, and polysilanes are solid at Titan surface condition. So that might work very well as well. And so there are possibilities. We study Titan conditions in Trinidad, which, of course, something doesn't fit as a temperature, right? But, of course, we don't find anywhere on Earth a place where we have so cold temperature and we have liquid methane. But what we do with our research group, we're looking at this liquid natural asphalt lake, and there's only 3 places on Earth, really. That is here in Trinidad. There's one in Venezuela, but there's crocodiles and mosquitoes and drug dealers, and so we don't want to go there. And the third one is on the Iran-Iraq border, and maybe Rip likes to go there, but I don't. So we study it here in Trinidad. So what we found that the water activities, the amount of available water is very, very low. But our latest results indicate that there are little tiny water droplets in the asphalt lake, and there's basically mini ecosystems in those droplets. And they are ideally adapted to make a living in this liquid asphalt. And if you're interested, we just published it in Science about a month ago. So that was really kind of showing a way how life could still survive there. Obviously, what I hoped for is that those organisms in the liquid asphalt lake, this is a nasty material, by the way, how they would maybe use the hydrocarbons as a solvent for life, but that didn't quite happen. In science, you never get really what you wish for, you have to deal with what you get. So, and that is, again, that is a picture, aerial picture of the lake. So you see, it's actually pretty, here's a house, it's pretty big. There's an oil tanker, so it's, there's a lot of oil everywhere there. This is some of the bubbles, the methane bubble coming up. This is the mouth of a mud volcano there next to it. So it is a very interesting area. Missions, we wanted to do the Titan-Saturn system mission. I was a co-investigator of that one, which consisted of a NASA orbiter, an ESA lander, and a research balloon. Just imagine how cool it would be to fly there above the lake on Titan. Of course, you can't breathe that stuff, but it still would be nice just the thought about it, and nobody planned a human mission there. Unfortunately, it was not funded because they gave a Europa mission the priority, but the Europa mission appears not to fly either. Well, anyway, this is a sad story. There's another sad story, and that was a Titan Mar Explorer. So that was a budget version, basically, of the Titan-Saturn system mission. And just to have a lake lander, because we can use, just if we have the lake lander, basically can have your antenna and send the signal back. And the interesting thing are really the hydrocarbon lakes. Titan is the only body in the solar system where you have liquids on the surface, not liquid water, but liquid methane and ethane, and there could be something living in it. So the idea was to launch it 2016 and get there 2023. Ligea was a target here. This is about the size of Lake Superior. Backup was Krakenmare, and a launch vehicle was Atlas 411. And the payload was really not that much. The most interesting really is the mass spectrometer. But like I said, unfortunately was not funded either. It's a little bit of a political thing too, because the Cassini mission is still, the Cassini orbiter is still orbiting around Titan, and then the others say, okay, you have your orbiter, and we want to go to, I don't know, to an asteroid, to astronauts. Asteroids are boring and forms from astrobiology, but still, there's a community too, and they want to go somewhere else. Although Titan is clearly, from the potential for life, one of the most interesting places to go. Okay, now we're finally leaving the solar system. Although I must say my preferred place to be is actually in the solar system, because there you have the most data. If we go now to the exoplanets, we don't have that much. Most of them are M stars, actually, and so that are a little bit tinier stars than our sun. And we can only imagine what life would be there and how different would it be. Of course, we would need something like this to go there. Yeah? And with remote sensing, we can't really do too much, but it's still quite amazing. Like I said, it would be, most of them are M stars. They're just much more common. Yeah? And the M star is much smaller than a G star. So I hated to bring it to you too, but we are kind of the freaks with being around a G star. Most of the stars are actually about 85% are M stars. And the M stars, the orbit, the habitable zone, or where there's liquid water on the surface, which isn't really the habitable zone because you can have liquid water below the surface, or you could have a different solvent too. But anyway, this is a conventional thing, is much closer. My favorite system or I should be careful, what was my favorite system, because we're getting soon to it, is Gliese 581. It's 20 light years from us, and there's 4 to 5 possible planets. And 20 light years, of course, is still pretty close. There's Gliese 581c, which is a bit like Venus. And then I was very excited about Gliese 581d. And I tell you why. It's about 10 times the mass, or that was inferred, of Earth. So it's a super Earth, right? It's pretty big. But then it's an orbit that is very similar to Mars. Of course, it's closer to its star, but then the star is less powerful, so it's an equivalent orbit of Mars. And you know, with Mars, the problem is it's cold and dry, but because it's so small. If it would be much bigger, then it would probably have a magnetic shield around, water on its surface and all that. And if you put a super Earth there, that should work. Unfortunately, newest results show that Gliese 581d might not exist, that it was only a glitch. So that shows you with the data. And if you have soon someone coming who talks about exoplanets, you should ask after the robustness of the data. There's 3 other ones I just want to briefly introduce to it. That one is pretty interesting, Gliese 667cc. That is 22 light years from us in this constellation Scorpius with a minimum mass of 4.5 Earth masses, so it's not that giant, all right? It's actually part of a triple star system, but the 2 other stars are so far away that we, for practical purposes, don't really have to worry too much about them. Mean temperatures might be around 30 degrees C, 85 Fahrenheit, and they might be uniform around the planet. You know, they say on the website probably, but there's no way to infer that, you know. There's actually no way. It could be much lower, much higher, but this is the equivalent temperature that you would expect, you know, if there's not much of an effect of the atmosphere. It has an ESI value of 0.84 out of 1.0. 1.0 is, this is Earth Similarity Index. With this, you have to be a little bit careful too, because it only says similar to Earth. And even though in a paper that I had with many co-authors, I pointed it out several times, everyone uses this and no one uses a planetary habitability index. The problem with the planetary habitability index, of course, is that we don't have enough data really to specify it. For the ESI, we do. But we have to be careful because even our moon has a relative high ESI index because it's a big terrestrial body, you know, it is in the habitable zone, right? But no one from us would think that it is habitable. So you have to be a bit careful with that. Then is Kepler 62e. That was the second top choice here with the ESI value of 0.83. It's in the constellation Lyra, about 3.6 Earth masses and an estimated radius 1.6 times that of Earth. So this is basically things that you can get. You cannot get what the atmospheric composition is, at least not now yet, with some few exception of some gas giants. You cannot know whether there's an ocean on it or whether there's plate tectonics or whatever there's on it. Temperature is estimated 31 degrees C, and it's about 7 billion years old. Significantly older than Earth. That would be important because if you look for complex life, that usually needs time. So there we could expect maybe something more advanced. Because on Earth it took already 4 billion years to get to 3.5 billion years to get complex life. But unfortunately, that didn't come out very well. It's 1,200 light years away from Earth. So, you know, we probably won't know anything about that for a long time. And then there's one that I'm excited on still because it's so odd. It's Captain B. That is the oldest known exoplanet in the so-called habitable zone. Captain B is about 13 light years away and at least 5 times the mass of Earth. So that actually is pretty close. That would be nice. The star and its planetary system is estimated to be 11.5 billion years old. 2.5 times older than Earth and only about 2 billion years younger than the universe. So this is quite amazing, But unfortunately, we have then the problem, you know, the heavier elements come through supernova explosions. And we probably have the only hydrogen and helium, and, you know, then we wouldn't expect life. But and the only reason why it is so close, because it actually doesn't belong to the Milky Way. It was kind of caught from some other system. So life on exoplanet, what I like you to take with it is that habitable does not mean that life exists on these planets. Even if they're habitable, we don't know, because the constraints on the origin of life are likely much more narrow than the constraints for life. Because what we can see, if you once have life there, it can basically adapt to nearly everything. Not everything, but a pretty wide range. We see this on our planet. But the origin of life, that is probably much more difficult. You know, we have to have the right conditions. And we don't really know much at all about the environmental conditions of the exoplanets. But since there are so many of them, and we know now at least 1,000 have been confirmed, there's about 4,000 or 5,000 candidates. So at least on some of them, you would expect, if the origin of life is not incredibly difficult, on some of them there should be life. And since there are so many of them, you know, I guess it takes us as retroactive justification of what I do. Everything what is physically, chemical, and biological possibly should probably exist somewhere. And as one example of that, for that, let's use this exoplanet. Let's say this is a planet around a neutron star. So you have huge magnetic fields over there, and this is a way how organisms reproduce on that neutron star. This is originally from Jerry Feinberg and Bob Shapiro, and I found it always quite amazing, because a lot of anthropocentric humans or scientists say, oh, DNA is so great, you know, or it has to be DNA or RNA, and some say, okay, maybe some other chemical nucleotide would work too. But how about that? You know, you have here a chain of magnetic atoms, and that is your information system. Then you have a new magnet coming to it, and that one orientates itself parallel to the magnetic chain. And then you have more and more coming, and then you have it reproduced. And this seems to be fairly easy, right? It's identical rather than complementary. What I never understood why our genetic code is complementary. That is much more difficult. And it's sensitive only to the direction and not to the magnet size. So in such a world, you know, where you have a lot of magnetic field, that would be a nice way to do it. And maybe not only there. Okay, on the very end, you know, and it won't take long anymore, I can calm you down, that won't be long anymore here. But at the very end, I just want to go even further out. What about intelligent life, right? And of course, the problem is the Fermi paradox. When Enrique Fermi was apparently was not doing a coffee break, but at lunch, they asked her, where are they? And nobody knew what he was talking about it, but he meant the aliens. Because this is usually used, it's not really an equation, but we refer usually to the Drake equation. If we put that together and see there's so many planets out, and you know, there's a lot of stars, fraction of stars is planetary systems. We know there's tons of them now. So we have a little bit more certainty here. Number of Earth-like worlds per planetary system, fraction of those Earths where life developed, where intelligence, technological intelligence, and then lifetime. We would usually assume, oh, there should be many of technologically, oh, it's getting long here. Advanced life there around that use technology, right? But we don't see any. So what could be the problem? And I show you now some possibilities without that I'm wedded to any of those, but just to get this kind of ideas. But before we do that, let's make the problem even bigger, because von Neumann suggested this kind of von Neumann probes and says, you know, with all the civilization that could be out there, just assume that there's one that really is into the exploration of the galaxy. And they built this kind of probes that go by 1/40th of light velocity. We could do something like this too, or pretty close to it. And they are self-replicating. And then in 4 million years, they would have explored the whole galaxy. So 4 million years, that may sound a lot for you, but as a geoscientist, that's nothing. Our planet is 4.6 billion years old. So, so the question is, where are they? And you know, of course, a lot of those stars, they are much older than our star. We just saw some aligned with the exoplanets. And that seems only logical that many civilizations would be around far ahead of us. So where are they? Well, that was an exhibit in the London Zoo. Perhaps we are a human zoo or a designated nature preserve. Or if you want, you are Trekkie, it's a prime directive, right? They don't want to interfere with us. So that could be a possibility. If you know this guy from a Star Trek version 2, Professor Moriarty, are we and our universe around us only part of an elaborated computer-generated hologram? And that maybe at this first things maybe seem to totally out, but if you think that there's this observer effect in quantum mechanics, you know, if the famous example, if a rock falls down on the other side of the moon and nobody saw it, did the rock really fall? You know, then we have information entropy, that is radiation around black holes. So we always think about physics, but maybe information trumps physics. You know, that would indicate, well, computers, right? Video games. And then it's kind of odd that the natural constants of the universe are exactly so timed, exactly so narrowed down that there's life as possible. Of course, you can explain it how it's usually done with the multiverse, but there's another possibility, right? And you know, as a scientist, of course, nobody likes to be a subroutine of a computer program. But as a scientist, we cannot say what we like to be. We have to look where the evidence is, right? Even if we don't like the result. Okay, well, that's maybe too deep, but perhaps the answer is much simpler. Let's see, we're going in the rainforest to Venezuela, right? And we discover a new worm species. Do we really make every new effort to communicate with this worm species? No. So we are the worms, right? Or perhaps advanced civilization self-destruct at critical junctions in their development. You know, there was sometimes the idea with the black holes or through particle experiments or nuclear holocaust or so. But you would think that some of the life or complex life would have mastered those kind of problems. That some of them probably blow themselves up, but not all. Let's look from it from a different angle. Energetic emissions such as radio waves that are neither highly regular nor highly random. That would be a way how to detect intelligent life. So we'll look at that. So far, nothing. It was just at the meeting at the Symposium of Astrobiology and Society, and there was the Shostak. There was nothing so far. And the additional frequency, nothing either. We didn't find anything of this, what was proposed by other people either, so that didn't really quite work. But of course, we could find structural complexity, something like this. That maybe not looking very beautiful, but if we see something like this, oh, that seems that someone built that. Or over here, even more, and perhaps that is not that difficult because we leave our junk everywhere. We would find it now on the moon or on Mars or so. So if this astronaut suddenly finds something like this, can say, okay, there was intelligent life. You know, maybe it's not there anymore, but at some point it was there. But obviously we haven't found anything like this either. Nothing so far. So what could be wrong? So perhaps we have to go back to the origin of life. Perhaps the origin of life is hard and statistically very unlikely. It happens so rarely that in fact we are alone, or there are only a few other instances where that happened. We can't really see that. You know, back to this equation. FL is fraction of Earth where life developed. If this is very, very low, the whole number is very, very low, right? There may be the critical factor. And with the Miller-Urey experiment, the famous one, we thought, okay, that is so easy. You know, you have your primordial soup, you put some lightnings inside, some meteorites, and voila, the microbe is crawling out. That hasn't really happened. And that seems to be very difficult. And what is even more humbling from the research as I do, you know, the physicists can tell me what happened in the first fractions of the second of the universe. And we have life just right in front of us to study, and we still haven't figured out how the origin of life happened. But of course, it's not only our fault, because hardly anyone funds that. You know, there's no industrial application to it. Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel suggested directed panspermia in 1973. That means basically the idea that we were brought on our planet by some other intelligent species. I spoke with Leslie Orgel personally about that, and he said first, oh, that was a joke. And I said, well, how can that be a joke? You published that in Icarus, you know, that is a respected planetary science journal. I said, oh, Francis Crick, after he got the Nobel Prize for the DNA, he could publish anything. But the thing, if you read that, it is actually nicely logical consistent. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem because it puts the origin just somewhere else. But the thing is, this is something what we basically could do nowadays, or we are very close to. We just need a nice target for it, right? And now we're starting to get what looks like habitable exoplanets. So if we are really concerned about that our DNA survives, we could build rockets, put microbes, a nice slew of different microbes in a dormant stage in petri dishes, and then shoot them to other places, right? And even if they're 50 million years in space, it doesn't really matter. They can survive that long, and then they come nicely down in the water, and if there's water, and if they land at the right spot, they may then reproduce, and you know, then there's Earth life on some other exoplanets. Or perhaps we are looking the wrong way. Conventional space travel is arduous and time extensive. So maybe, you know, that is more the thing of science fiction or nuts or something maybe. But advanced intelligent beings just travel in form of energy or with a mind or spirit or something like this. But of course, whoever blames them, you find them in the nut house. So that doesn't work, right? And we wouldn't even know whether we are sensible enough to perceive something like that. So, what about Earth? Is there actual life on Earth? Let's assume we are this kind of alien, the cute alien that I found at the beginning. And you can breathe out, that is a second last slide now. But, so this is a cute alien, and he flies with a ship right next to Earth. What does he see? Well, first he sees lots of water, right, a water planet. Then he sees that there are large areas without cloud cover. That means enhanced UV radiation. Our alien is smart. He knows that UV radiation is not good for life. And remember the story about Venus, right? If there's no protection or something like that. So he knows UV radiation is not good for life. Then he finds the presence of an aggressive oxidizer, oxygen, here in the atmosphere. Our alien is smart. He knows life is based on organic molecules, right? Oxygen is not good. It oxidizes those. And in fact, if he looks here in the atmosphere, there are hardly any organic compounds in the atmosphere. And if he looks further, he can measure that the atmosphere is with 21% oxygen near combustion level. And looking further, if we turn this here around, probably part of California is again burning. Then he gets really scared because there are regional sized fires on the planet already. And what he thinks, let's get the hell out of here before the thing blows. And by the way, anyway, how would life could exist dissolved in this solvent that we call water? It dissolves everything. It can't build any organic thing, something big. How could that be possible? Yeah, for that. Of course, you know, there's of course reason why the alien would find that there's life on Earth, but it depends on your perspective, right? And part of it is with what perspective we go at it. We have to really move our perspective from different angles. And finally, if you're interested in more of that stuff, I published a book, Life in the Universe, Expectations and Constraints, that deals with it academically. This is more the popularized version, Cosmic Biology. Then I couldn't help myself to write a science fiction novel, and Mega Catastrophe was a fun other project. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. We have a procedure. There are people with microphones, and we're going to try to take some of the new people first. So there's a man in the back there. Roy, there you go.
Good evening. I wonder if there's been any effort to expose some of Earth bacteria to some of the conditions that you've been outlining, say in Venus, and see if it can evolve closer and closer to the conditions there.
Well, yeah, actually we're doing this right now with one of the research programs that we do. We expose them to Mars simulation chambers. And the bacteria, for a large part, actually survive there. And when we looked at lichen and put it in a Mars simulation chamber, if it was exposed to the full UV screen, the lichen would die. But if it's in niches inside, it actually would survive and photosynthesize. So it seems to be that at least under Mars condition, certain organisms can survive and maybe even reproduce. But it have to be niche ones, so they can't be fully exposed to the radiation level on the surface.
Doctor, thanks for your presentation. There was a notion.
Sorry, let me interrupt for a minute. When you get up and you ask a question, can you tell us your name and whether you're a member of the society or affiliate?
Sure. Joe Wilson, a member of the society. An oceanographer who discovered the Titanic gave a lecture this last summer where he was talking about a lake at the bottom of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. It seems like environments like that are very great arguments for life possibly being in other places. So that sounds almost like something that might be like Europa or Callisto. You have a lake and there's actually living things inside that lake.
The situation is a bit different. It's not really a lake. Because what is then referred to it by some people is that there's a groundwater lenses in the area underneath the Gulf of Mexico that may be methane clathrate and this kind of situation. The thing is that you have a lot of different microenvironments, or in that way even macroenvironments that are hidden that usually we don't look at. And what we can do is find a lot of great different kind of organisms and adaptation methods. But this is still different. The analog for Europa or one of the icy moons is usually Lake Vostok in Antarctica, because this is a real lake, there's no rock in between or so.
Hi, Carl Merrill, I'm a member of the Society. In your mentioning planets to look at, I noticed you didn't mention the big gas planets like Jupiter or Saturn. And I remember years ago that Arthur C. Clarke wrote a fictional book about life living in the gas phase on Jupiter. And so it seems that you could use the same probe system you suggested for Venus in the gas on Jupiter, because there may be layers in Jupiter that have a...
Right. The problem with the gas giant is there's no ways how we can imagine origin of life in the gas giants. For Venus, we have a planetary surface which we believe is necessary for it, that you have interactions with a solid medium and liquid. And you don't really have that on the gas giants. So, and on Venus, the life in the clouds is basically adaptation mechanism because the surface became uninhabitable. So for Jupiter or Saturn, I mean, I remember Carl Sagan, has the floaters and the sinkers. I mean, they were great ideas, in how something can work. And if there's something existing like that, you can imagine doing that. But I personally don't see a feasible way how you can have an origin of life and get to this place. Where for Venus I can see it.
Now, the other thing is that there apparently are radio signals that come from Jupiter that don't seem to be random. We don't seem to understand what they are. I just mentioned that because...
but of course, Jupiter has a huge magnetic field, right? So I don't think anyone is suggesting that, there's an alien sitting there and beaming us signals. And that would be so close they can come right away by if they do.
I'm David Rosen, life member, and you said about Titan that, or was it about Europa, you said that with the methane should have disappeared within 10 million years if the UV was exposed. Now Jupiter, as a matter of fact, all the gas giants have lots of methane in the atmosphere. Well, why wouldn't it disappear in these larger planets with methane atmospheres?
Well, part of the reason is because they're radiating out the radiation. So inside the within the gas giant, it's more protection actually that you would have their methane. And you have to also realize that methane is a very common compound. So it's CH4. So you have lots of them. And a lot of their mass is basically, I mean, they're gas giants. It's methane, there's some CO2. And there's actually organic material, quite a lot of organic material in the gas giants as well. And the bottom line is still that, we have that on Earth. We have methane as a source of microbial metabolism, the rice paddies or the microbes in the cows that produce methane. So that's why, so naturally on a terrestrial planet where you have silicate and water, you don't otherwise get much methane. And for Mars it was kind of a signal as well. And for Titan in putting it over there is a icy moon, but it has some of the similar structure.
So basically Jupiter was so big the UV couldn't get...
Yeah, the UV, well, the
volume ratio is...
Well, see, the icy moons getting, they're getting more radiation from Jupiter and Saturn than they're getting from the sun, from the gas giant. And so the magnetic field really builds this up and basically projects it to the outside.
Yes, Greg Meyerhoff. I am not a member. Question is, I looked on your slides, the financial analysis of a return trip is about 4 times the cost of going. That's considering a point A to point B trip. I can't be the only one to have thought of it, but assuming that there'd be multiple stages for operations on what's planning due on Mars, what type of consideration has been done, at least financially as well as practically, that have an intermediary step of putting on a base on the moon? We have a gravitational factor that's like, I forget the number, it's like 1/5 or 1/6 of that of Earth. The cost of takeoff would be significantly less, as well as the cost of getting there would be less as well. Again, that would depend on the game plan, but can you tell about consideration of that?
Well, first to Mars, and I mean, that were only rough estimates, and the return trip is so much more expensive because you have to get the fuel, you have to load it up on the way to Mars to come back again, and this makes the whole calculations really high. What we asked for actually to NASA Ames and to some private sponsor to do a feasibility study. We asked for $85,000 basically to do a feasibility study, how to pull this off the best. But we never got the amount together, and so we didn't really end up to go a step further. Even though there was 1,000 people who wanted to go, but that was a different thing when you asked for money. Regarding moon, I can't say actually too much, because for me the moon has only two significant things. That is for astrobiology. First of all, it produces the tides, which are very important for the magnetic field, and also may have something to do with the origin of life. And the second thing, on the South Pole, there's a lot of ice, which may be holding some traces from the early evolution of life, and that you could use that still as a resource for water for future astronauts. So the thing is, I'm not really the expert to ask about the moon. The only thing what I still can say to it is the moon is really bad to live, because the radiation is so strong that you have to basically go 2 meters underground. I mean, I think that the Martian atmosphere is very thin, it's about 8 millibars of mostly CO2, but that has an enormous shielding effect already. And then on Mars, you have water ice, which is very close by. From the water ice, well, it may be a little bit controversial, but we wanted to, with a plutonium rod, you split the water, you have an energy source. With this energy source, you have right away oxygen too. You have water and the plutonium, you put it, and then you have oxygen. So you can have, and then you have soil that you can use and grow plants on it. On the moon, a lot of things you simply can't do. So while the moon obviously is much closer and it would be cheaper to do something, as long as you don't have for astrobiology, it doesn't really work, To have a sustainable base or people living there, you really need the resources from Mars. As a stop for between, maybe not a bad idea, and instead of the International Space Station, I would have rather seen a moon base as well. But if you put something on the southern pole, maybe it's a little bit better, but I have really not looked too much into that possibility.
I'm going to take the last question. So my question is, so we have Miller-Urey experiments and attempts to reproduce it to look for the evolution of life under conditions that existed on the primordial Earth. And we had a talk by Lee Cronin. I don't know if you know him, but he's got another kind of experiment along those lines, and he's trying to look for signatures of life in inorganic matter. And I'm wondering to what extent you or others have tried to reproduce some of the conditions, say, like those on Titan or Enceladus or Europa here on Earth, and look for signatures of life evolving under those conditions, and what would you look for?
Well, that was several questions at once. But let's get first to the Miller-Urey experiment. We have reproduced those, and by the way, the early Miller-Urey experiments were wrong because there was too much methane inside. We now know that the atmosphere contained more CO2 and just traces of methane and probably some hydrogen. So it is much more difficult to get actually those ingredients. So we did the Miller-Urey experiments to see, okay, we have getting the same thing, and then we actually did this under Titan conditions. But we did cheat a little bit, because what we did, we say there's no way we can simulate at minus 200 degrees C, right? And first of all, it's very expensive, unless someone would generously fund that kind of stuff. But we can't expect it even. So, and it would take forever. It would have to get very old as well. So how we did that, we said, well, there's asteroids impacts on Titan too, right? So what we do, we simulate an asteroid impact, and that would melt the water, and we get ammonia water, and we did this instead of water. For Earth, we use water, then we use ammonia water, and then we use the atmosphere of Titan, what it is now, and then we put electric discharges there, because we know when we have this kind of impact, we have electric discharges as well. And we got quite a bit of interesting amino acids out of it. So in addition, what the Miller-Urey experiment showed. So, and that we published about a year ago in the journal Life. But we have to still be careful about it because amino acids are not life, right? We are still long away. And the main problem what I see with the origin of life is you need basically, well, you need a genetic code or information system. You need something that gives you energies. On Earth, that's proteins, so that you can do some work. And you need some membrane, otherwise you will just have equilibrium. Everything is dead, it doesn't work. And you have to have all three of them in a very close encounter at about the same time. And they have to actually work together and not fight against each other and so on. And this I see extremely difficult. And I think that is a really big puzzle. So we can make experiments to get some building blocks and to get some interesting thing. But to really make the case, I haven't seen even a really good hypothesis that we can test for that.
Life is difficult.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Before you go, we have a little present for you. This is a
thank you.
Framed copy of an announcement of your talk tonight, signed by the members of the PSW General Committee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Can I have your-
Oh, yeah.